Audio Solutions is a new-to-the-U.S. speaker manufacturer. They're from Lithuania and have a broad range of models, of which the Vantage M on test today is next to the top. They have a distinctive and impressive sound, befitting the $123,000 price. Of course, you have to judge value based on your needs and your budget. Let's take a look. I'll start with a product description. The Audio Solutions Vantage M takes an unusual approach. It might appear to be fairly conventional, but several design elements struck me as noteworthy. First off, this is a four-way design. If you look at the speaker, you'll see two 7-inch woofers, along with a 6.5-inch mid-range and a 1-inch beryllium tweeter. But what you don't see is a downward-firing 10-inch aluminum cone woofer placed on the bottom of the cabinet. Four-way speakers aren't that unusual in this price range, of course. Where it gets interesting is when you look at the crossover frequencies and driver pass bands. The 10-inch woofer crosses over at 50 Hz. Then the two 7-inch woofers run from 50 Hz to 200 Hz. This two-way bass setup, combined with low crossover frequencies, is presumably a way to tune bass for real room conditions. Audio Solutions is rather specific about the room sizes that their speakers are designed for, so logically they know something about the modal frequencies and room gain. At least they know more than if there's no design target. The other unusual element is that the 6.5-inch mid-range driver runs from 200 Hz up to 8 kHz. This is somewhat like so-called single driver speakers, which often augment the single driver with a sub and a super tweeter. The Vantage seems conceived to gain the advantages of crossoverless mid-range while delivering nearly full-range output. A final, somewhat unusual element of the Vantage M is the presence of adjustable mid and treble level. This is provided by switches on the back of each speaker, giving 4 options for each range: plus 1 dB, 0 dB, minus 1 dB, and minus 2 dB. So you have 16 combinations possible. That gives you some tuning ability without making you crazy, or at least that's the idea. Settings are also repeatable with the use of the switches. I will comment that this feature seems rational to me, given that differences in rooms, speaker-to-listener distances, and distortion profiles of electronics matter. I'm unclear why such adjustments aren't done in the bass, though effectively, overall bass level is adjusted via the mid-range control. This is a fairly big speaker, standing 56 inches tall, 18 inches wide, and 26 inches deep. They weigh 165 pounds each and use a dual-layer cabinet construction with the interior and bracing made of Siberian birch, whose slow growth is said to increase density. The structure is computer modeled to minimize resonances. The speakers are available in dark gray or white. Sensitivity is 89 dB at 1 meter with 1 watt input. Nominal impedance is 4 ohms. The Vantage M is wired so that it can be tri-amped. I use 2 Esoteric Grandioso M1X amps with 600 watt per channel capability. These are lovely amps, but with that esoteric je ne sais quoi, I don't think most people will need such heroic capabilities. Frankly, given past experience, I think the 100 watt per channel Esoteric S1X Class A stereo amp might be a match made in heaven, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now let's talk about sound quality. This is where I remind you that I can't reason, and you probably can't reason from features to sound quality. That's not a ding on you or me. That's actually the difficulty of the current measurement state of the art. So we listen. As always, our goal is to describe what the product does and doesn't do. Your job is to assess whether that performance suits your needs. Every product has distortions, so it's easy to imagine that different distortion profiles will suit different listeners. Said another way, we objectively evaluate the performance of the product with reference to the absolute sound. You subjectively determine what sonic profile will make you happier with your system, with your music. All right, let's start with sound staging. The Vantage M is among the 2 or 3 most impressive speakers I've heard with regard to imaging. The Magico M7 and the MBL 101 are different, but also impressive just to help you calibrate my remarks. And of course, I haven't heard everything. The Vantage M combines 4 sound staging qualities, each of which is done about as well as I've heard. The first is left-to-right granularity. This seems like the obvious thing we're talking about when we talk about imaging, and it is, so I add that the Vantage M is able to differentiate performer positions as precisely as I've heard. That might sound like a mixed blessing, but I found it almost completely beneficial. Combined with the other qualities I'll discuss, the left-to-right precision simply seems more believable. The one case where this enhanced believability doesn't happen is with some very old recordings that seem to have been mixed with, say, 2 performers on top of each other and panned hard to one side. The Vantage M isn't faking the image, so when the recording is flawed, you hear it. The second sound staging virtue of the Vantage M is front-to-back layering. Again, the Vantage not only indicates depth, but by delineating the degree of depth of certain performers or portions of ensembles, the Vantage M is remarkably lifelike. This is, of course, recording dependent. The third sound staging quality is performer size and air. This may be the secret sauce making the left-to-right and front-to-back performer placement believable. When you have precision, but lack appropriate performer scale, the illusion is shattered. The Vantage M renders the size of performers very effectively and makes them and their instruments seem embodied. The fourth win in the sound staging department is placement coherence. Most speakers have some percentage of the image that at times is rendered on the speaker. I view this as incoherent when the rest of the image doesn't align with that placement, a more common phenomenon than I'd like, and not what happens with live, acoustic, or non-PA music. The Vantage M will place images on the speakers, but this goes along with forward placement in the plane of the speakers for central images, and it fits with the left-to-right granularity that I discussed. Coherence, naturally enough, goes with believability. Now, the Vantage M isn't perfect in the sound staging area. Even more expensive speakers, and a very few at lower prices, can create a larger image. Doing this only when called for is the trick, but it can be done. I should also say that the Vantage M is still quite good in this department and avoids the all too often image slice phenomenon, where the image seems to be decapitated at about the top of the speaker cabinet. This is a tough parameter because image height isn't specifically encoded on stereo recordings. The other element of imaging that some may care about is group imaging. If you assume that in a group, listeners will be seated, but only one can be in the central sweet spot, you might want to know how speakers work for listeners off the central axis. Remembering that the physics of stereo are not designed for this situation, I thought the Vantage M performed surprisingly well. It gives a good sense of performers being arrayed between the speakers on a stage, even for listeners seated outside the left or right speaker position. The sound there isn't like the sound in the sweet spot, but listeners far left or far right in a concert hall don't get the same sound as listeners in the middle anyway. I was worried that the 6.5-inch mid-range, with the inevitable narrowing of output in the low treble, would hamper this. But I think it might actually be a strength here because the radiation pattern changes so smoothly. Really, who knows? But in the end, it works pretty well. Now let's talk about bass performance. The next highlight of the Vantage M is in the bass. The Vantage M does a very good job with bass definition combined with bass weight. It isn't the best in either category, but it is often the case that speakers with strong bass or good extension, or both, are not the last word in bass definition. To some degree, this isn't the fault of the speakers. Every room has bass resonances that you hear more clearly when bass levels are somewhat higher and or deeper. One solution is to go in the opposite direction by rolling off the bass so that bass harmonics are emphasized. You get definition, but give up weight. In the event, the Vantage M seems to thread the needle here with good weight and good depth, but good definition as well. I'm hesitant to make too much of this, room-dependent as it is, but the Vantage M has a distinctive bass tuning that I suspect many listeners, if they tried 20 or 30 tracks, would find close to optimal. Point being, if bass is a troubling challenge in your experience, you really should hear the Vantage M. At the same time, if you regularly find yourself thinking, I want more bass, the Vantage M is probably too neutral for you. Now, let's go over dynamics. I observed that the Vantage M does dynamics very well, but I think this doesn't quite capture what is going on here. As I've noted before, some products call attention to their dynamic capabilities, but there are two possible problems with this. One is that the dynamics are exceptional only in a certain frequency band. That may be exciting, but it isn't how real music works, and it thus runs counter to the goal of believability. You may not care, of course, and you may cherish the excitement, especially since it may compensate for the lack of resolution on some systems. The Vantage M doesn't play favorites, though, in terms of dynamics. It does bass, mid-range, and treble dynamics quite well, and because it delivers very high resolution, you don't really need extra excitement. The other possible problem with highly dynamic speakers is that they end up generating listening fatigue. Part of this, I think, comes from the difficulty some extra dynamic products have rendering delicate or flowing tones. You may never listen to material like the Alexander Malafiev album, Forgotten Melodies, but Malafiev's ability to play at the soft end of the piano's range is simply superb, and you hear it on the Vantage M. My point is that you might not hear it on speakers that are artificially more dynamic, and this is part of what makes me say that the Vantage M has natural dynamics. That and the observation that the Vantage M does a great job on rim shots and timpani and bass plucks. Now this brings us to voicing, because I do think the tonal balance of the Vantage M might not work for rock fans who want to amp up kick drum closer to gut-punching levels. Practically speaking, I've measured many rock concerts with 95 dB average levels at their seat. You can produce those levels at home, but your family or your neighbors and your hearing may rebel. An alternative is to bump up the mid-bass, kick drums are tuned to mid-bass frequencies, to simulate the punch of concert music. This is similar to what happens with concert goers who wear ear protection, wisely. The Vantage M isn't natively designed for this intentional distortion. Overall, the Vantage M has a slightly top-down voicing. This simply means that the frequency response sounds very smooth, so octave-to-octave variations are minimal, leading individual instruments to sound right. That's not as common as you might think. But with the Vantage M, the slope of the frequency response is closer to flat than to, say, the Harman curve, which declines at 1 dB per octave from bass to treble. The Harman curve is based on perceptual preferences measured across many consumers, so it contains various curves that people prefer. My point isn't that the Harman curve is right or wrong, but that products like the Vantage M do something different. Actually, as I pointed out, most speakers do not follow the Harman curve. The difference with the Vantage M is slightly more upper mid-range and slightly less lower mid-range than you may be used to or you might experience in a classical or jazz concert setting. Again, bass is pretty flat to low frequencies, but it isn't bumped up. All right, with all of that detail, let's just do some comparisons. I don't have a ton of comparison material for the Vantage M. There simply aren't as many $100,000 speakers as there are $10,000 speakers. And logistically, not all of the really high-end products work out for review. But I do think two highly relevant comparisons are with the Magico S5 and the Wilson Alex V. In summary terms, the S5 and the Vantage M are broadly similar in that they're very revealing and have minimal character. The S5 is somewhat less top-down in voicing, though the Vantage offers a bit of extra bass energy as well. The S5 just comes across as exquisitely or relentlessly neutral. Contrast both with the Alex V, which is impressively tuned to help slightly bland recordings come alive while not messing up the best recordings too much. This sonic profile is highly desirable for many listeners, but it does seem to come at the cost of the last ounce or gram of transparency. and I think the imaging of the Vantage M and S5 have small advantages that spatially sensitive listeners will care about. Speaking of small advantages, you don't need a $100,000 speaker. Speakers at 25% of this price level or even below can be musically very satisfying. And when we're talking about these price levels, I think many people overemphasize speakers as the key to performance and underemphasize electronics. The differences between speakers are bigger, but that isn't the same as saying the benefits of different and more expensive speakers are bigger. Difference can be created by distinctive bundles of distortions without necessarily lowering overall distortion. That said, there are refinements in these expensive speakers that you can't quite get at lower prices. If you're sensitive to those refinements, such products offer excellent value. I want to close with a discussion of character. It's great to get into the details of particular performance categories, but in the end, I think a lot of prospective buyers want a net view of the sound profile to take away. Not my opinion, but a view of the sound profile. Overall, with the Vantage M, you end up with a character that emphasizes resolution across the frequency range. I think you have to combine that with the idea of natural dynamics I discussed earlier. The Vantage M delivers the rare combination of highly natural and highly resolved sound. Combine that with state-of-the-art imaging at this price level, and you have a winner for listeners who value real music. I hope you've enjoyed this review of the Audio Solutions Vantage M speaker. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you again soon.